Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which will explore Tanzania and its position as an investment destination for the mining industry, hosted by Mining Review Africa and Africa Mining Forum, in partnership with the Rwanda Mines Petroleum and Gas Board and TSC, the stakeholder company. My name is Laura Cornish. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Mining Review Africa and your moderator for today. Africa Mining Forum and Mining Review Africa are glad you could join us once again through our MineIt platform, where each and every one of you is a part of our growing community, where together we remain connected 365 days a year. Tanzania has been through some mining legislative turmoil over the past few years, but the tides are turning and the country appears to be making a slow but definite comeback. And it is in the country's best interest to do so. It has vast mineral wealth across a variety of commodities that really count, including nickel, rare earths, graphite, lithium, and of course gold. But has government done enough more recently to provide investors with the confidence they need to pursue these minerals opportunities? If you are asking the same questions, then myself and my very expert panel are here to provide those answers. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome them onto screen. This includes Warren Beach. He is the CEO of Beach Feltman. Also Jason Brewer. Jason is the CEO of Mayflower Capital Investments. I also have Barure Ngocho. She is partner for IMMMA Associates, a member of DLA Piper Africa, and Andrew Cheetle. Andrew is the COO of Tanzania Gold Corporation. Thank you, gentlemen and lady, for joining me today to talk about what I believe is a very relevant subject for the mining community in Africa. So before we get started, I have a few housekeeping rules to cover. The session will be available on demand after today on our digital MineIt portal under the Watch on Demand tab. You can be sure to share this with your fellow colleagues who couldn't join us for the live session. And to add to that, you can continue networking on the platform even when the session is over. We are also welcoming questions from our audience today. You can submit them via the live discussion box on the right-hand side of your screen. Alternatively, there is a questions tab you can click on to submit your questions as well. You also have the option to meet your peers on the platform by clicking on the community tab. This is a fantastic networking opportunity. And lastly, we'd like to encourage you to share today's webinar with your social networks using the hashtags Africa Mining Forum and Mining Review Africa. So thank you all for your time today. It's going to be an interesting discussion. To officially kick off, I'd like to invite the audience to participate in a poll, which we'll leave open for the first half of our 75-minute session. You will find the poll question next to the questions tab at the top right-hand side of your screen. I absolutely encourage you to vote. It's great insight to see how you as our audience are feeling right now, and for our panel to discuss your views later on in our session. So I'll quickly go over what the poll is asking today, and that is, would you invest in mining business opportunities in Tanzania? And we've given you three options to choose from. The first being yes, the country is making a positive comeback. 2, no, the country's political instability is still problematic for me. Or 3, I'm unsure, but hopefully today's session will clarify my sentiment on the region. So as I've said, we'll leave that poll open for the first half of our session. So right, that is everything I need to cover to get us started. And let me once again welcome Warren, who will start us off by sharing his opening views on our topic today. Thank you, Warren.
Thank you, Laura. So every single country at the moment that has any minerals are an area of focus. And the question obviously is Tanzania an area of focus, and should it be an area of focus? Tanzania, certainly in my view, has got two advantages at the moment. One, it's got the right minerals, and secondly, it's got the right president for the right time. When it comes to the minerals, the two broad areas of the minerals, the safe haven minerals, gold, and we've seen through COVID just how important having gold reserves are and the investment in gold. And then, of course, it's got the minerals which support the green economy going forward. And Laura, you mentioned nickel and graphite, etc. But those, the associated minerals, platinum. So Tanzania's got the right minerals at the moment, and that's very good for Tanzania. And secondly, and there's obviously different views about it, but President Magufuli was seen as a challenge. His very direct manner and the way that he went about his business was viewed in a particular light by many investors. President Hassan has taken a slightly different approach, and it certainly seems to be working from an investment perspective. So 2 very important features for Tanzania. Obviously, a couple of challenges, 2 challenges being competition. Competition from West Africa, very strong competition there, and the ease of doing business in West Africa, and then the broader Asia. And when we talk about Asia at the moment, we're talking all the way from China through to the Middle East and through places like Kazakhstan. So strong competition, a lot of changes there, which are encouraging investment. And then secondly, the Africa, or the perception that Africa is dangerous, another hurdle that all African countries need to get over, and particularly with everything in the press about Cabo Delgado, that perception. But generally speaking, and from our experience, Tanzania is looking good for investment in the short to medium term.
Excellent, Warren. Thank you very much. Great positive sentiments for us to start on. Jason, are you in agreement with Warren? Do you think Tanzania is in a good place for investment right now?
Without question. Without question. And I first got involved in Tanzania back in the late 1990s as a financier, and was involved in the funding that went in to get the Bulyanhulu gold mine developed, also the Anglo Gold's Geita gold mine to be developed. And clearly the country benefited tremendously from the growth in that mining sector throughout the late 90s, early 2000s. And it was obviously very disappointing to see what happened 4 years ago with the change of policies. But I must admit, I'm a Tanzania bull when it comes to the mining sector at the moment. And I think what the new president and her cabinet has achieved in a relatively short space of time has really given a lot of impetus to companies to get back involved, to raise funding, both from the equity markets in Canada, Australia, the UK, and also to secure debt funding out of major institutions as well, development agencies and so on. So I think what we are seeing now is that re-emergence of the sector, an impetus of companies to get back to complete exploration. And there's many companies that have raised that funding and are already actively there on the ground with new drill rigs drilling. So I think that's a sure sign that investment community, the international investment community, is embracing the changes and the positive tones that the Tanzanian government and cabinet are giving to mining investors. So full agreement with Warren. I think it's not without its challenges going forward in the coming months. And I hope it's not a honeymoon period, so to speak, but I'm very hopeful and very keen to progress opportunities in the country.
Excellent, Jason, thank you. I like that word re-emergence. I think it's very pertinent to Tanzania. So I'd like to hear from Burure next. Burure is actually based in Tanzania. She's on the ground and she's close to the mining industry there. Burure, what is your sentiment on Tanzania? You're on mute, Burure.
I think the word used by Jason of re-emergence, I think it's definitely the right tone. Tanzania has, since the emergence of the mining sector with the laws in 1998 going forward, they've been quite responsive to the mining sector and the needs of the stakeholders. Despite the short hiccup with the Tanzanian legal framework had in the past sort of 3-4 years under the directives of the previous president, the current administration seems to be quite interested in putting all that back on track. So in terms of the legal perspective, which is where I come from, I'm seeing that there's definitely a positive view held by the government and trying to get things back on track and to try and listen to the stakeholders and to understand where the issues are and to try and make sure that the laws align with the views of the stakeholders. Obviously keeping in mind international standards and the competition that exists across the world in order to try and make Tanzania a better environment for investment. So I think we're going towards a very positive future. I'm hoping it's not just the honeymoon period, but for the long run.
Thanks, Burure, and good to hear that government is open to engaging closely with the stakeholders to make those right calls. So great to hear from you as well. Andrew, last but not least, let's hear what your sentiments are about Tanzania. I'm sure and hope you're going to agree with our other panelists.
Thanks, Laura. You would have thought after a year of these type of calls, I'd always remember to unmute. I totally agree with all the other panelists, and in particular, I can talk of my own experience since coming on board at Tanzanian Gold at the beginning of the year. We've seen a very significant change in the sentiment of potential investors that we work with, ranging from initially from like, "Ooh, I don't think so," through to please tell us more, who have invested and this happened in such a short period of time. So I know you said earlier that it's changing slowly. I'd have to say it's changing actually very, very rapidly. And then from an investor's point of view into the country, what we also find is that it's incredible. So for example, I drive myself around. No need for security detail. I can hop into a rental SUV and get on with the work. And for example, at Buckreef, our workforce is 100% Tanzanian. So companies like Anglo Gold, Barrick have been here for many, many years. And there are some extremely skilled and talented people who are Tanzanian and able to get on with the job.
Brilliant. Andrew, thank you so much. And an absolutely overwhelming sentiment that Tanzania is a good place to do mining investments. So thank you to all my panelists. So I know we've started on a very positive note, but we do want to understand and contextualize the situation in Tanzania. So as I've said in the beginning, and we all sort of agree that Tanzania has undergone some legislative turmoil in the past few years. Warren, don't you want to contextualize the situation for me? What actually happened to spark this turmoil, and what were the immediate consequences of that?
Laura Barrera's touched on it to some extent, and she mentioned the legislative changes. But if we go back to 2010 and before 2010, there were obviously mining laws in place, and I think most investors and mining companies were relatively comfortable with that. And you're looking at the Anglo Gold Ashantis, the Barricks, etc. in that period. Changes started, or the government started talking about changes in 2014, 2015. We heard the rumors, we were involved in that. And then, of course, 2017 came and there were major changes under President Magufuli's regime. And those were quite dramatic. They impacted on stability arrangements. They impacted on retention rights. In other words, the ability to retain prospecting licenses for some time before special mining licenses or licenses were applied for. And that was a major blow to the industry, and particularly the stability that investment typically needs for decisions to be made. And those legislative changes, both to the primary laws and the regulations, had that adverse impact. And if you look at the top 3 or 4 of those impacts, the first was the free carried interest, in other words, the 16% interest which government had to have. The second was the domestic requirement for dispute resolution, and that any disputes could not be dealt with in the international field, but had to be dealt with in Tanzania. The indigenization laws, and again, I just want to emphasize this was not new. Africa generally has gone the nationalism route, and the mining laws are following suit. In other words, trying to make sure that a country benefits as best as it possibly can from its natural resources. So the indigenization requirements, the first 151, then reduced, and the localization rules all had an impact. But probably the most negative impact was the Acacia fight. And that was a very, very public fight. The initial demand from government was $190 billion, which the government contended Acacia had not paid government for sending concentrates overseas without declaring the minerals in the concentrates. And that was very, very public, and the amount was just so astronomical. To talk about $190 billion would have frightened most investors. But if we go back to basics, and this is really the point that I think most of us on the call will focus on, the relationship was bad. So Acacia's relationship with government was not good. And any international investors who don't have a good relationship with government, it's not for a moment saying that you have to sit back and not take on government if you think that things are wrong, but the relationship was bad. And I think, again, everybody knows that dispute was dealt with because Barrick stepped in. Ultimately, as the parent company, had stepped in. and the dispute was essentially resolved through the joint venture. Money has been paid, $300 million was paid in back taxes, and it was regarded as a win-win situation. But the Acacia fight and the very public nature of that fight certainly put a spin on it, and that came from the 2017 changes to a large extent. And then, of course, the retention, and a number of other companies also then took on the government, is the retention licenses. And in a summary, once you've done your prospecting, quite often it's not the right time to go through to a mining license phase, and you want to retain your right over the land. And the regulations that cancelled that certainly created some controversy and some concern. So that was the context. It was really the 2017 changes by President Magufuli. And as I mentioned earlier, for me, it's the right president at the right time. President Hassan is trying, without taking away President Magufuli's legacy, but certainly trying to soften the edges with a different approach to the mining sector.
Brilliant, Warren. Thank you. A good succinct summary of the situation and how it played out. Burure, how do you think the industry reacted or responded to those changes that were sort of implemented around 2017 when the Acacia Barrack sort of situation played out? And perhaps, Burure, you could also highlight some of the key changes that were actually implemented, or expand on what Warren has said, that were in terms of, mining in Tanzania, some of the greatest impacts that were had on the mining industry.
Of course. As Warren has touched on a little bit, the changes that came about in 2017 all started off with the Acacia/Barrack Gold's situation with the government. And that did put a lot of the mining companies and the entire mining sector sort of on hold and wanting to see what happens next. And it was quite unnerving because no one knew who would be next, because it was quite a public fight. It was televised. Special committees were formed, so it was quite a public fight. That resonated not just in the mining industry in Tanzania, but globally. It was widely discussed. But then what then went on to happen is that some of these things that were being discussed during this fight were then made into law. So in 2017, Warren has touched on a little bit about what happened in 2017, which was there was an overhaul of the mining legislations. So there was amendments to the Mining Act. Just to highlight a few amendments to the Mining Act, there was the Unconscionable Terms Act and the Sovereignty Act, all enacted at the same time. And with each one of these laws, they did bring even more uncertainty and instability to the mining sector. So, for example, the Unconscionable Terms Act basically allowed the government to overhaul the existing MDAs, mining development agreements. So they could bring these to Parliament, go through the terms, and then determine what terms they did not think to be unconscionable. And the unconscionable, the test for what was unconscionable was so wide and so vague that the potential was that some of these agreements could be made unbankable because of some of those changes. For example, the biggest thing was dispute resolution mechanisms within those agreements, where the law specifically said that any arbitration had to take place in Tanzania through arbitration boards in Tanzania. So in those cases, everyone who had an MDA that had a dispute resolution mechanism which called for arbitration in a neutral ground, be it in Europe or in the Middle East, were facing the potential of those agreements being null, those provisions being null and void. And in most cases, that had a heavy effect on the financiers of some of these projects, who found that should you not have a sufficient dispute resolution mechanism, it put the whole project in danger. The other thing was the introduction of the local content requirements. Warren has touched on those. They weren't too peculiar to Tanzania because, as he said, it's sort of a Pan-African movement that had been happening in West Africa that had already been seen. So for most of the mining companies, they were not too shocked as to this requirement, because to some extent they were already included in some of the employment laws and some of the mining laws generally. But this time round, the laws went very specific and introduced the local content regulations, which then called for the suppliers within the mining sector, etc., to have almost forced joint ventures with Tanzanians for them to be able to provide goods in Tanzania and for them to definitely have a base in Tanzania. And it went so far as to change the terms of the mining and special mining licenses to state that the mining companies had an obligation to make sure that the contractors that they took on board were compliant with the local content regulations. So this from an operational standpoint, also caused quite a bit of uncertainty for the companies. In some cases, you might find that they had specified or preferred suppliers, and since these suppliers no longer met the local content requirements, the mining company would have to start changes with that. And even the suppliers who were well established within the market now also had to adjust themselves to make sure that they comply with these laws. And despite them not being something that's too new to the mining sector within Africa, but the companies were given 3 months to comply when the regulations first came out. So that was a very short period of time within which they needed to comply with, and failure to do so came with hefty fines for both the contractors and the possibility of the mining company having its licenses revoked for failure to ensure that their contractors comply with those changes. So these are some of the things that definitely shook up the industry in 2017. And they had a big impact on the mining industry in Tanzania.
Laura, could I just support what Barori said in particular? Sorry, just if I could support what Barori said in relation to the dispute resolution and just how critical that change was. Typically in a mining agreement, you want two things. You don't necessarily want local law to apply, so specifying which law applied to the interpretation of the contract. And secondly, you would typically want a dispute resolution jurisdiction such as London, where you would go and have your fight. And those two changes were quite material. It makes people nervous. It makes the lenders very nervous if they've got to go into a country and have the fight in a country with all of the consequences that can go with that. So that was a major concern, and Barori's obviously explained that in a bit more detail, but we certainly found that was a major concern to the investors in Tanzania about where to have the fight and if they would get a fair fight. That was really the key concern at the time.
Great, Warren, thank you. Barori, thank you. It's obviously very important to have that legal contextualization of the situation so we can really unpack how the industry is progressing from that point. So thank you both. I think at this point it's really...
If I may, Laura,
sure,
I just want to jump in a little bit here in Barori's excellent comments. And, part of the trick is obviously to avoid getting into fights and to avoid having to have dispute resolution. And we must remember that's often a very extreme case and not that often the outcome of disputes. So what we're finding, and we are building a new mine in Tanzania, what we're finding is with the local procurement laws, they're very clear. Now, the steps that have to be taken. And as Rory and Warren have mentioned, there's constructive dialogue with the government through the Chamber of Mines, which has been completely reinvigorated, actually, and doing a great job now, that the government's willing to listen to discussions. And I think when President Samir came in, that it was a matter of weeks before we were involved in cross-party, cross-team delegations and discussions with the government. I think perhaps one of the most difficult things for the mining industry is the threshold of having to engage the Mining Commission is about $100,000. And of course, in mining, that's not a lot of money. So we're finding that we do have to prepare very carefully and very quickly. But if you know the rules of the game and play by the rules of the game, it works smoothly. And we're also working with the government, as I say, to make that easier for people. And we're finding that they're listening at the moment. So I'd hate the listeners to go away thinking that, it's all about going to dispute resolution. That is often the outcome of relationships that have obviously gone very, very wrong. And we're finding that so far that we're able to have responsible, respectful relationships that I think it's an industry change as well, as we all know, as we focus a lot more on ESG, that we're all moving towards more of a development partnership approach, where shareholders will get their returns, but also we'll be working in terms of helping nations build themselves, and also, of course, a lot of work with the local communities.
Thank you, Andrew, and good to see that Tanzania Gold Corp has stuck with their objectives and their strategy for Tanzania, even though it's gone through, I could put it, a rough patch.
There's
Jason,
a whole new management team in, yeah.
Excellent. Jason, let's bring you into conversation. So I know that Mayflower Capital Investments is relisting on the LSE, and that your company's objective is to become a strategic mining investor in the whole East African region. So even while, for now, your starting point is restarting that Kilimapesa gold mine in Kenya, I'd be interested to hear how Tanzania fits into your strategy, and why are you optimistic about the country in light of what's been going on and some of those difficult legislation points that have been raised?
Sure, thanks, Laura. As you mentioned, we're actually completing a listing of our East African focused gold company called TRX Gold. That's going through on the London Stock Exchange, the main board, on the 23rd of August, so 3.5 weeks away from today. But that's been almost 12 months in the making. So a lot of hard work on the ground here in Kenya. As you said, our principal asset at the moment is a producing mine here in West Kenya called Kilimapesa. That's actually located just 30 kilometers from the Tanzanian border. And, you know, we share the same geology, we share the same language. So Tanzania, with a far more advanced gold mining sector, is something which clearly fits into our strategy. We are very much East African focused, and we actually announced yesterday that we're going to be the first mining company to list on the Nairobi Stock Exchange, which is a very major commitment to the region. Our corporate headquarters are here in Nairobi, and we've already identified office space in Dar es Salaam, where I've been, I think, 3 times in the past 2 months. We had our supply, our procurement logistics team up in Mwanza at the beginning of the week, already preparing ourselves, meeting local suppliers, local contractors, as part of this process of getting more involved in Tanzania. Look, we like Tanzania because we believe we can replicate what we've achieved here in Kenya in the past 10 to 12 months. We aggressively brought in an asset which had been undercapitalized, which hadn't been able to secure funding because Kenya is not as well established as Tanzania from a traditional mining destination per se. But it has a similar approach in terms of the requirements for local content. But it aligns with our policies as a company. We employ local, we source all our local equipment here, suppliers. We've grown our employees from less than 10 in August to over 300 now, of which 98% are all from the local communities in and around that mine. We're an African company, I should say. The only expat in the company is really myself. The rest are all Africans, be they from Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, or South Africa. So operating in Tanzania, we don't see it as a challenge. I think you mentioned there in your question some of the challenging legislative requirements. We don't see that. It's just replicating what we've done here and how we're going to go about things. So we've had a good education, I guess, over the past 10, 12 months here in Kenya. We are operating the only commercial scale gold mining operation in Kenya. So we believe going into Tanzania and looking and identifying and securing projects which, because of what's happened in the past 3-4 years, have been starved of capital, have been starved of being able to access the international markets there. That's where I think we can leverage off what we've achieved here and move very quickly. Like I say, we're already identifying office space. Our procurement logistics guys have been up in Mwanza for the past week. I'm due up there in 10 days. So we're moving very quickly, and we're hoping that once we have TRX listed in the next 3 weeks, we'll follow that up with some very positive news on what we can do in Tanzania.
And the proof is in the pudding. So
Absolutely.
I think everyone...
Anybody can say, talk a great game. It's about getting on the ground, as a lot of our colleagues here have done, and doing it. I mean, you've seen companies which have been starved of capital on the back of the changes that have happened over the past 3 months. Investor sentiment, I think Andrew mentioned it earlier, investors didn't want to talk or hear anything about Tanzania. Now they want to get involved again. I think it was Allcorp when they had their special mining license issued. Within 2 weeks, they went out and raised 50 million to complete additional exploration, and they've already identified new areas of gold mineralization, and to update their feasibility study. So investors want to get involved. They just want to know what they're getting involved with. So, and I think the current government is doing a great job, and we're very keen to follow up on that.
Yeah, Jason, I think, you refer obviously to what we might consider Western-based investors, Europe, United States, Canada, for example. But what we're also finding here, and I'm sure you do as well, is local development banks, and indeed even the local banks in Tanzania are quite keen to also look at investing. And it would be my interpretation that they're also gearing up to be able to lead major debt financing for mines to be built. Have you had any thoughts on that?
Very much. Look, I mean, I think it was ASX company Walkabout that came out and announced that they'd secured funding through one of the local banks there. So there is capital available. There is that capital available domestically, and it is now. Beforehand, companies didn't look towards the domestic markets to fund their capital, particularly in places such as Tanzania. But now I think that capital is available. They're looking for assets such as what's here. There's been over 20 years of operations of some of these major gold mining operations, which provide good returns. You've had Barrick come out and announce that they're considering, some major investment into their operations there, North Mara, Bulyanhulu, etc. So I think the more local content, and it's not just about suppliers, local financiers getting involved, the better. Already within 24 hours of announcing our listing here on the Nairobi exchange, we've been approached by a number of local investors, small institutions that haven't got that asset class available to them here before. And they're looking to support what we're doing. So I've got a very busy week ahead on the back of that, which is fantastic news. And I'm hoping to replicate that, like I say, when we get up to Tanzania in the very near future.
All right, gents, thank you. I'm going to bring our conversation back to Warren and Burure. And, yes, we're all in agreement clearly that government is making the right moves with regards to the country, but can you maybe unpack this or dissect this in a little bit more detail? Burure, maybe I can start with you, and if you can give me maybe 2 key areas of positive change that has happened more recently in the country.
Yes, definitely. The biggest thing I would say would be the change in rhetoric by the government. That has been crucial to the mining sector. And with this, they've been quite, as has been said by all the panelists, it has opened up the mining sector to the stakeholders feeling more included, and that their views are taken into consideration. The president has been quite open in inviting stakeholders' views when in Tanzania and also when she was in Kenya, to make sure that if there are any pertinent issues that need to be addressed in order to create a better environment for the mining industry, for those to be presented. And so with that lead, everyone else who's working under her would also have that same attitude towards the mining industry. So that's the key positive change that I can honestly say. The other changes, which is legislative, I believe will take some time to come through because she does not exactly want to be seen as unraveling everything that President Magufuli has done, but by having that attitude clearly set forth for her and her administration, that is definitely one of the main positive changes. The other one is that I've seen that there's moves towards even the mining sector itself, if this happened even before the departure of President Magufuli, to try and clarify and also deal with some of the stakeholder issues, because after the initial laws were passed in 2017, it was evident that the mining sector did receive a bit of a knock. So even before President Samia came into power, there was already moves to try and stabilize the mining industry. So this was also a very big and positive change. I spoke earlier about the Arbitration Act and the possibility of a dispute. The concentration with that was not so much on the issue that you would get into dispute with the government, but just that the financiers wanted to see that, so that to make the project more viable. So then the Arbitration Act was amended, and that amended the Unconscionable Terms Act, which then meant that arbitration can take place in Tanzania, but by international arbitration bodies that financiers could find confidence in, like the LCIA, etc. So that's the one of the other changes. Also, the state participation regulations came in. Warren touched on briefly at the beginning the free carried interest that was introduced. So the state participation regulations also helped to clarify what exactly it meant, because the law changed to say that the government would have this free carried interest, but there was no explanation as to the modality, what those shares would entail, what rights would attach to them. So by having those regulations in place, that definitely opened up the mining sector to understanding exactly what is meant by that. And in terms of the Unconscionable Terms Act, again, that I spoke about earlier, thankfully, we have not heard of any agreements or MDAs after the Acacia and Barrick issue going to Parliament and being unraveled and any terms being overturned. So that, again, created some sense of security and optimism for the mining sector. But definitely the current positive change is the attitude that the government is going with to try to further make the mining sector stronger with the inclusion of the stakeholders.
All right, thank you. Warren, are there any other areas that you would perhaps like to highlight in terms of positive change that's coming out of the country?
Laura, probably falling into three categories, and Barrera has touched on them, but just elaborating on them a little bit more. So the first one is the external message, and that is 100% correct. So the president's external message to the rest of the world has been the investment is important, foreign direct investment is important, and we will try and work with you to make sure that happens. So the externalized message is absolutely critical, whereas President Magufuli was not as open and honest and not as externalized. The second one is internal, and again, the president has been very vocal in saying to the departments, so the mining departments and the regulators, that they need to work with the investors, they need to work with the mining companies and make sure that the applications for the prospecting licenses, mining licenses, etc., are dealt with very, very swiftly. So that's the internal message. The third one has been the legislative changes. In other words, the talk of the changes, and correctly, a number of those have not been implemented yet. But as the changes come through in the Arbitration Act, very important, because as I mentioned earlier, one of the key concerns was the dispute resolution process. And Andrew and Jason mentioned it earlier, but the point is you don't want to get into disputes, but you always have to plan for a dispute. Particularly as the lawyers on the call will know, we have to plan for the divorce, and if the divorce comes, you want the best possible arrangement for whoever you're acting for at the time. So those changes have been very, very important from a domestic regulation and statutory point of view, and it has given investors a better level of comfort. But in all three places, external, internal, and the regulatory framework, all working towards a more positive view in Tanzania at the moment.
Excellent, Warren. Thank you very much. Andrew, I know you also wanted to comment on this particular question. Andrew, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's all been said, actually. I think Warren's summation there has just been really excellent. It's all moving in the right direction. And in particular, I'd like to make a little shout out for the Minister of Minerals. The Honourable Minister is really sort of pushing for the industry to move forward. And we must recall also that in the board of COVID, that Tanzania's broader economy has been very badly hit by, in terms of tourism, reduction of tourism. And so eyes are on our sector to get on with it, to build mines, to produce gold and other minerals, to put some royalties into the government coffers and to give jobs. So we're finding a lot of, shall we say, positive encouragement, but also a very clear, please get on with it. And we don't mind that at all.
Great, Andrew, thank you very much. So I think let's take a quick break in the panel discussion, and I'd like to reveal the results of the poll that we ran with our audience. As a reminder to my panelists, our question was asking, would you invest in mining business opportunities in Tanzania? And the results, in my opinion, are actually quite interesting. So 46% of our audience said yes, the country is making a positive comeback. But the other 46% of our audience were actually unsure. So I hope that, some of the things we're talking about this morning are actually going to help resolve that uncertainty. And then only 8% of our audience said no. So I think mostly or more positive feedback. Jason, what are your thoughts around where our audience is at in terms of those results? Jason, I think you're on mute.
Geez, Andrew was right. After doing this for well over a year, we should be a bit smarter with technology, shouldn't we? I'm actually quite surprised. I thought there would be a far stronger amount of support on the country's comeback. Seems a lot of people are sitting on the fence there, which surprises me. But I guess people want to see if it's going to continue. As I think I used that word, the honeymoon period. As you've seen in all aspects of politics, when somebody else comes in, well, not just in politics, in business, when a new CEO comes in, you get that opportunity, a bit of a honeymoon period where you can come in and you can make sweeping changes and people will naturally get fully behind you. Perhaps, yes, people are just waiting to see, is this here for the long term? There's a lot of quick fixes which have been made very, very quickly, obviously. So it's some of the other ones which may take longer and may be much more difficult to achieve. I'm not sure, but yeah, I'm very surprised with that.
Now, Barure is nodding her head. Are you also a bit surprised, Barure? Do you think the industry is waiting for that honeymoon period to sort of settle down a bit?
Yes, actually, I'm not as surprised to have so many people on the fence and being unsure, just because once bitten, twice shy. So the new president has only been around for 4 months. She hasn't finished a year yet. So they want to see whether the rhetoric will be supported by the action. So most people would still be on the fence, but we're all very optimistic that this is not just a short pulse of renewed interest, but more one that's more long term. So I think predictability is the key issue in business. Like Andrew said, people just want to know what the rules of the game are before you jump in. So if recently there had been changes and now they're changing back, you want to see how stable this change is and how long it would last. So I definitely understand the skepticism in some of the audience.
Thanks, Barure.
Laura,
if I
could just comment, just again in support for, although we've spoken about the Acacia fight, that's obviously just one element of what came out of 2017. The cancellation of the retention licenses were problematic. Companies plan their mines 10, 20, 30 years on their ability to retain the rights to the minerals over that time. The cancellation of the retention licenses were problematic, and that is probably still very fresh in investors' minds. But the other thing, and again, I'm not sure if the rest of the panel's experienced this, but there's another very strong element at the moment, and that is the short-term investment. So we're seeing a very strong shift in investment thinking to shorter investments for a quick return and a very high return. And Tanzania's mining industry doesn't necessarily support that. So if you've got a big coal field, for example, the investors are going in, they're putting the money in, they know that fossil fuels are dirty, toxic fuels, and then people are sources of fuel and are moving away from that, but they're getting in, they're making a lot of money, and they're getting out. If you're trying to invest in gold or you're trying to invest in PGMs or whatever, it's a longer term play. And that is certainly our view on why countries like Tanzania, which should be doing a lot better at this point in time, may not be doing as well as they could. The investment patterns are changing. I think the investors are looking at different investment at different life cycles of a company. And the risk profile changes over the life cycle of the company. And at the moment, the key investors are looking for a quick return, a very high return in a risky environment. And I think that's probably also impacting on Tanzania at the moment.
Yeah, Warren,
Warren.
one of the key points. Oh, sorry. I just want to say, Warren, I mean, of course, one of the things for investors to look at in terms of quick returns is, of course, a re-rate based on jurisdiction. And as Tanzania becomes more favorable, so the investors get the re-rates very quickly.
Thanks, Andrew. Jason, what are your investors' sentiments around Tanzania? Are they reluctant? Are they open? How are they feeling at the moment?
Very supportive, actually. Whilst we've been progressing things with our negotiations in countries with a number of parties there on the underlying assets, in parallel with that, we've been dealing with a number of groups both in the UK and in Europe. And I guess they're looking at Tanzania in a far more positive way than what they were looking at with us in Kenya 12 months ago. I think, like I say, the jurisdiction, the historical jurisdiction of Tanzania as a gold mining sector, clearly we're involved in the gold, is very strong. You've got world-class operations there, and you've got the potential for others to be developed. And investors can see that. Investors, unfortunately, can be like goldfish. They really can. They move on very quickly. They're looking for, as Andrew said, they're looking for a return on their money. And as you know, at the moment, there's no return keeping your money in the bank. In fact, you go into Europe, you're actually paying to have your money you're paying interest there to the bank for them holding your money. So they are looking for opportunities. And without question, Africa, East Africa, Tanzania has projects with the potential for re-ratings on their investment, be it on an equity perspective, a structured debt instrument, which is becoming increasingly available, a gold-linked instrument increasingly available in the market at the moment. So our investors, having supported us very well over the past 10 months here in Kenya, which I would suggest is a far more harder jurisdiction to raise money for the gold mining sector, are looking at our broad strategy in East Africa and saying, Tanzania, yes, absolutely, 100%. We'll support you. And we have funding lined up, which will allow us to complete the project acquisitions and fund the initial exploration, but also advance some of them very rapidly through to production. So they want to see that. A lot of investors don't want to be sitting there with their money, call it tied up, locked up, with a long exploration phase. They want to see, a company aggressively pursue its projects. And I think with what we are hearing and what we are seeing in Tanzania is perfect timing from our perspective. I think we're very fortunate with what has happened with other companies far larger than us with far greater capital resources than us, have been put off from Tanzania because of the risk profile and the ability to travel. It's an hour flight for me to get up to Dar es Salaam from Nairobi. Our logistics guys crossed the border from the mine earlier in the week, drove up to Mwanza. So we can do that. And for that reason, I think our investors are very supportive of what we're trying to achieve. And that comes from both investors in London and particularly in Europe as well.
Brilliant, Jason. Thank you very much. I think I want to bring one or two questions in from the audience at this point. And for those of you that do have questions for our panel, please do feel free to submit them and we'll reach out to the relevant panel. So Warren, this question comes from Carla Neves and I think is actually really pertinent to our conversation. And she's asking if you could share your perspective on the artisanal gold sector in Tanzania and its potential to attract investments now that the government has installed safe and legal physical marketplaces in the main mining centres, and also it's opened its first gold refinery. Andrew, what are your comments around the artisanal mining sector in Tanzania?
Just confirming, Laura, is that to Andrew or to myself?
I'm going to ask it to both of you. So Warren, you can go first and then I'll hand over to Andrew.
Yeah. All right, let me go. So ASM, or artisanal and small scale mining, is quite an important component of any mining industry. It's always just a question of how it starts. So if you compare, and just very, very briefly before we get to Tanzania, if you look at South Africa, we've had a very, very strong formalized sector, but we're moving towards artisanal. And unfortunately, artisanal also in the South African context means illegal mining. And you compare it to somewhere, for example, in Ecuador, where they started artisanally, regularized that, and now have gone into large scale. The changes in Tanzania to accommodate the small scale mining, absolutely critical. They have to be part of the bigger sector. It has to be regularized. The consequences are quite dramatic if it is not. Typically, if it's not regulated, you've got the environmental risk, you've got the syndication risks, you've got the gold, for example, a good example, flowing illegally to neighboring countries, being refined illegally. So the fact that it's been, and the Tanzanian laws accommodated, I think absolutely critical, and certainly in my view, a good thing. It contributes significantly. It also takes away the immediate pressure on getting benefits to communities. Communities in and around bigger mines and where these deposits are located benefit a lot quicker and just generally benefit well from small scale mining or artisanal mining. And as soon as it's regulated and legal, my view is it's far better than what we've got, for example, in South Africa, where our illegal mining is increasing. It's estimated to be 20–30% of our mining at the moment is unregulated illegal mining, and that's not a good thing.
Andrew, do you want to comment? Andrew, don't make me use the mute button.
I think, Jason, that's 2-1 to me. In terms of unmuting. The artisanal scale mining is very much a feature of Tanzania. So, for example, at our Buckreef project, we have our neighbours, artisanal miners, and they're very well organised. Exactly as Warren said, there's now gold markets in place. It's very much a recognised part of the industry, and I think how we relate to the artisanal scale miners who hold incredible political influence in Tanzania is also very, very important. So for a larger scale miner, so for example, we're going to be putting in a pit that may be some 2 kilometers long, 300–400 meters deep. The artisanal scale mining in that sort of environment would be the top 3 to 5%. And so how do we relate to that? How do we build our relationships with the artisanal scale miners is also going to be very, very important. And it's also very much a feature of discussions with government, in terms of once we've done land compensation, how do we peacefully, constructively move people off the property when we need to. Now, in our case, we don't have people on the main zone, but we have some people, as I said before, adjacent to us. So they might come and scout on the property. So we just have to draw very clear boundaries, very clear timelines. And so far, our relationships have all been very, I'd have to say, cordial, very respectful. I'll go and chat with the miners that have, say, for example, 300 or 400 meters just off our boundary. And at the end of the day, we're both miners. Right, so we have a little bit of bonding talk about how deep they're going down, what are they using, what kind of chemicals, and Warren's point about environmental is so very, very important. We have to be very careful about the use of such materials as mercury, for example, or the handling cyanide. And so there's a little bit of discussions around those as well.
Excellent, Andrew. It's good to hear you have cordial relationships, lots of bonding. I think it's really important that those elements of the industry work together. So that's another good news piece for Tanzania.
Laura, just again to come in on Andrew, the relationship with the ASM, absolutely vital. And Andrew's touched on that not only on a practical level, but also on a social level. There are a number of consequences. If you're not getting on with your neighbors, there are consequences, and it applies equally here to ASM mining. And on the environmental side, again, just touching, a lot of the work we've done there has been about the chemicals being used, as Andrew mentioned, and how deep. You can't imagine the potential impact if ASM miners are digging deeper. You've got water tables flowing into other operations with all the consequences and the negative consequences that can flow from it, from watering, dewatering, chemical flow, all of those elements. So there's a practical element and there's a relationship element. And the more support you get from that broader community, the better for your mining operations. That's certainly been our experience.
Yeah, absolutely, Warren. Of course, mine ventilation is also a very, very key part of it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Burure, I'd like to hear from you in terms of if you think there are other areas that government could be doing more of or doing it all to actually encourage investment further. I mean, there's a lot of good progress made. I mean, that's abundantly clear from what you've been saying. But could they do more? Is there areas that they could improve on? What is your stance on that?
Well, there's always room for improvement, and there's always room for more. I'm sure that the mining companies and other stakeholders would agree. There's always room for wanting more. But I think the most important thing at the moment is keeping up with the momentum that has been established. If this pace goes on the way it is, that will definitely lead to positive results for the industry and for the country as a whole. Preferably a change in some of the laws, because some of the laws still are hanging over the mining companies' heads, i.e. the Unconscionable Terms Act, etc., where companies, technically speaking, the parliament could still open up existing agreements and deem some terms unconscionable. But one step at a time. I doubt that would happen anytime soon, unless there is any actual issues that some of the stakeholders are facing, in which case through the Tanzania Mining Chamber of Commerce, they could try and present those to the government and try to see how they can be resolved. But as they have not been acted upon, it's highly unlikely that there would be any changes, because then it's likely for that to be seen as a direct unraveling of Magufuli's legacy, as it were. So, the changes in the law, I think, would come slowly but surely as time goes. But the most important thing is definitely momentum, and for the industry to be ready, for the regulators to be ready, the mining, the Ministry of Minerals, the Mining Commission, for them to be ready for the influx of the new interests that would be established by this new momentum. We've seen that some 46% of the audience is 50-50, is 46% sure. 46% is unsure as to whether to come back into Tanzania or not. Now, should we have that figure turn into positive, you're looking at well over 90% of investors coming back to Tanzania. So I think it's crucial for the Mining Commission and the Ministry of Energy to make sure that they have the capacity in-house to be able to deal with the influx. And this is in terms of capacity buildings, and not just in manpower, but people who are knowledgeable with the industry and who can have productive and constructive conversations with investors, instead of leaving it to a small niche department that would be able to deal with those new investors that come into Tanzania.
Brilliant, Burure. Thank you very much. I think there's been a lot of legislation discussion. We've really sort of unpacked that quite extensively. What we haven't really touched on is the mineralization in Tanzania. So I'd really like to hear from Warren in terms of what he thinks the mineralization opportunity is in the country. And then perhaps, Jason, you might like to also touch on that subject. So Warren, do you want to unpack the opportunities around mineral wealth in Tanzania? Warren, you are also on mute.
I am indeed. My apologies. So it's a very, the question itself is fairly complex because the situational mineralization is complex. But when I started, my comment was Tanzania has got a number of very, very important minerals. So the gold, the safe haven side there, but the other more important minerals is the green energy or the green cycle movement and all the minerals that go around that. So the moment that you are able to mine copper, silver, nickel, graphite, etc., you're already in such a good position. And Tanzania is, from a mineralization point of view, in a very, very good position there. The natural gas at the moment, also very exciting within Tanzania and going to create some interest going forward. Obviously, oil and gas at the moment is problematic, unfortunately, because of Mozambique and everything that is going around that, and concerns whether that can spread to East Africa as it did from Mozambique. And also helium, the helium project. So from a mineralization point of view, Tanzania's got it all. They've got everything that we need at the moment and everything that we're going to need in the future. It's an opportunity. Mining in every country is the engine room. It's also the barometer of how well the economy is doing. And if mining and natural resources is doing well, it's typically an indication that the economy is doing well. The multiplier effect applies. In other words, typically for every person working at a mine, up to 10 people benefit directly from that person's employment. But you take it wider than that. It's all the suppliers, and Barua has commented on the localization requirements, the Tanzanian companies that benefit from it, the service providers, etc. So holistically, the mineralization is an important component of growth, development, and transformation in Tanzania, and that's why it is such, again, mining and natural resources still going to play an important role in Tanzania going forward.
Thank you, Warren. Jason, is the mineralization opportunities in Tanzania one of the reasons why Mayflower is so keen on being in that country ultimately as part of your growth strategy?
Completely, and it's a mineralization which we understand very well because we're 30 k's across the border, and as we all know, geology doesn't respect national borders or boundaries. That whole Rift Valley area, Tanzania, Kenya, it offers tremendous opportunities, and as Warren mentioned there, rare earths, nickel, graphite, gold. I think all, unfortunately, have almost been stuck in traffic for the past 3-4 years. And all of a sudden now the traffic lights turned green. And you've seen rare earths, you saw Peak Resources receive their permit just recently, and that had held them up for a tremendous amount of time. Kabanga nickel as well. On the graphite, you had Lindian, Walkabout, Echograph, all of which were very active here in Tanzania a couple of years ago, well, a number of years ago before the issues with the change in legislation. And then, they all went and sought other opportunities in other jurisdictions. And, that investment dollar, which would have gone into the economy of Tanzania, has gone elsewhere. And, now all of a sudden, Tanzania's got to give the confidence back to people to bring that dollar back. It's a competitive market. Investors, companies such as us, we want to go to a place where we know we can take a project through all those stages of exploration, development, and production. Tanzania clearly has the mineral endowment. I don't think anybody can question that. But it's the empowering framework around that. What gives us the ability to go through those phases? What gives investors confidence that by supporting an early stage exploration company or early stage development company, that they can get that re-rating as the company delivers on its objectives? So I'm very optimistic, clearly, about Tanzania. We like the geology, we like the country. My Swahili has come on in leaps and bounds over the past 12 months here in Kenya, and I am so pleased that I can just cross the border and continue to speak this new language that I've learned. So it has everything. And you know, when you're here in East Africa and you're looking at growing a mining company, then clearly Tanzania is up there in terms of your priorities. That's not saying we're not having an amazing time here in Kenya. We are. And there's similarly a lot of opportunities here in Kenya, but the mining sector is not as advanced as it is across the border in Tanzania. There hasn't been a lot of that historical exploration. There's projects in Tanzania, as I'm sure Andrew knows, where there's been hundreds of thousands of meters of drilling, pre-feasibility studies, scoping studies done on these projects, which have stagnated for the past 3, 4, 5 years. And, you know, so I think there is almost a hockey stick growth that can now come back into the Tanzanian mining sector, which will allow us, all of us here, to get back involved in a very serious way.
Jason, thank you. Andrew?
I would agree with that, Jason. Yeah.
You know,
my background is geology. It is fantastic. As both Warren and Jason have hit the nail on the head here. There's a lot of advanced projects. There's a lot of projects which need dusting off, if I use that phrase. And I think there's also an awful lot to be discovered. We've just recently had some major discoveries on our own property, for example. But there's an awful lot to be done. I think we're also seeing inbound traffic. People starting to knock on doors and say, "Could you have a look?" We're completely focused on Buckreef just in the very short term, but the time will come when we will look over the property boundary.
Brilliant, Andrew, thank you. So as we approach the end of our session, sadly, it is going to be the end, I'd like to ask each of you to give me perhaps just a 1-minute roundup or perspective from your side on the conversation, or perhaps a key takeaway message that you'd like to give to our audience about Tanzania, just in conclusion of our discussion today. So Warren, I'll start with you. What would you like the audience to take away from today's conversation?
Laura, from my perspective, and the discussion has been really, really useful. I think collectively we're optimistic, and certainly I'm optimistic about where Tanzania is sitting at the moment. And I think there are benefits for both Tanzania, and obviously with the investment, and particularly on the gold side, the localization of the refineries and things like that, all very, very important, because it contributes and deals with the social issues, deals with the nationalism calls, it deals with all of those issues. And obviously for the investors, the more stability there is, the better. You can't have stability at the cost of inequality. So, you know, the inequitable positions previously do need to be dealt with, and I think we've moved to a phase now where all of that is being dealt with. But for me, the message is local knowledge and local involvement. By analogy, I mean, my first trip to Tanzania, I flew up, landed at the airport, and I said to my colleague who was already at the hotel, "See you in a half an hour." And he fell off his chair laughing at me, because I said 12 kilometers, half an hour to get from the airport into the hotel. And I never forget when I got there 2 hours later, when he was laughing and said to me, "Sit down, have a beer. That's how long it takes you to get to the hotel." But you only know that when you've been there, or you speak to somebody who knows what they're doing. So for me, it's always about working with very strong teams on the ground, including Tanzania. It's a beautiful country, beautiful people, and very, very important to work with whoever you can there to make sure you understand it takes a little bit longer than a half an hour to get to the hotel.
Great closing remarks, Warren. Thank you. Bore, let me hand over to you. What would you like the audience to take away from the discussions today?
Definitely not just the negatives of some of the things that are highlighted and the challenges that we face, but the optimism that there's definitely a change in the air, and a positive one at that. And that basically the mining industry in Tanzania is opening up again. it's been quite a strong industry for over 20 years, despite the small hiccups. It's quite a mature mining environment. And yeah, definitely keep on watching this space, and we're hoping that our female president keeps up the momentum and is able to bring this home. But as lawyers, we're seeing definitely a renewed interest in Tanzania from our stakeholders at different levels. And it's a very positive outlook that they're all taking, and I would want our audience to also keep that in mind in thinking about coming to Tanzania.
All right, thank you very much. Andrew, what would you close our session out today with? What was your takeaway?
Yeah, Laura, thank you very much. Asante, thank you in Kiswahili. I'm going to take a practical answer to this. I think we've seen some great legal comments from the prior two speakers. So Tanzania is a country where you can do business. There's a lot of skills, there's an awful lot of infrastructure, and as Warren said, like, you know, sometimes it could be actually 20 minutes to the hotel, or it could be 2 hours. But the infrastructure is here, particularly whether it's telecommunications, power, roads, that's all here. Workforce is here, the geology is here. I think we are going to see a very rapid change in terms of investor sentiment towards the country, and also that's internally and external investors. So I think the time is right. I think we're poised to also embrace a development partnership model between industry, state, and community. I think that is something three parties want to see, and I think it's also what the younger investors want to see as well. So I'll leave it with that.
Awesome, Andrew, thank you. And Jason, I'll ask you to close out our session today before some closing end remarks from myself. What would your key takeaways be, or a last message for our audience?
I think it's optimistic times. I think it's a time, as I said, of re-emergence. It's a time where people can look at it and they can use the word challenges, but it's an opportunity. It really is. The new legislation has, I believe, created a balance, and it's a balance which is increasingly coming into the mining sector of social responsibility. And I think we've all looked and focused on that. I think Tanzania is a jurisdiction which offers tremendous mineral opportunities, and now is the time really to get involved. I think it's on the up. I use the word hockey stick kind of kick up, and I think that's what we'll see over the coming years as companies such as Andrews, myself, and others are raising capital with the firm objective of actually delivering on the ground. And you know, I'm optimistic. I'll be there in the next couple of weeks, and keen to get moving.
Brilliant, Jason, thank you. And sadly, we do have come to the end of our session. We could, I'm sure, go on talking about Tanzania for a long time. But so on behalf of Mining Review Africa and Africa Mining Forum, I want to thank my panel for sharing their valuable insights with us, for being transparent, for being open and honest, and for really having a frank discussion about Tanzania. So I'd like to remind our audience that you can access the on-demand version of this webinar via our digital Mined platform and use it as a way to make new contacts, continue conversations, and become part of our global community. And don't forget to register and bookmark our next session before you continue with your day, which will look at lab-grown versus natural diamonds. And this session will run live on the 26th of August at 800 GMT. And that's all we have time for today. Thank you again to Warren, to Jason, to Barure, and to Andrew. Until next time, keep well and stay safe. Goodbye.